Well, having grown up a Chicago Cubs fan my entire life, I know something about curses. Specifically, what is referred to in Major League Baseball lore as the curse of the Billy Goat. The legend has it that a man named William Cianis, who owned a local tavern called the Billy Goat, brought his pet goat named Murphy to a Cubs game one afternoon. The story goes that the goat smelled so bad that fans complained and security had Cianis and his goat removed. Outraged, Cianis allegedly declared, "Them Cubs ain't gonna win no more," which had been interpreted to mean that the Cubs would never win another National League pennant, at least for the remainder of Cianis' life. Well, sure enough, that year, the Cubs went on to lose the 1945 World Series to the Detroit Tigers and didn't win another National League pennant or World Series again for 71 years. Now, there were many, many attempts during those years to break the curse. In fact, too many to rehearse this morning. Cianis himself, along with some of his family members, had even attempted to lift the curse throughout the years, including showing up with a goat to Wrigley Field several times, because, you know, that makes sense. At one point during the 2008 playoffs, the Cubs even employed a Greek Orthodox priest to sprinkle holy water around the Cubs' dugout, but once again to no avail. Finally, in 2016, on the 46th anniversary of Billy Cianis' death, the curse was lifted as the Cubs defeated the Los Angeles Dodgers to win the National League pennant and went on that same year to defeat the Cleveland Indians in the World Series. I can remember watching on social media in the days to follow the hashtags for Cubs-related posts changing overnight from hashtag cursed to hashtag blessed. Perhaps that's the reason since then I've taken notice of just how often that tagline is used. Hashtag blessed. In fact, it seems to have increased in use with regard to so many aspects of our lives. A friend posts on Facebook a picture of his new car with the saying tagged just below it. Another posts on Instagram a picture of the ocean, a drink in her hand, her feet in the water with the same phrase. Someone else posts on Twitter a story about Georgia's number 2 recruiting class in college football along with hashtag blessed. Of course, there's always that guy in the comments down below who has to post the story about Alabama's number 1 recruiting class with the hashtag doubly blessed. In fact, it's become such a common catchphrase these days, you see it just about everywhere you go. While on vacation recently at a theme park in Florida, I saw it on t-shirts at every turn. Not long ago, I read about a church who handed out sunglasses one Sunday morning with the same inscribed on them. Just a few weeks ago, I even saw it on a water bottle at one of my son's teammates at a basketball game. Now, don't get me wrong. We are all hashtag blessed. And owning that is something we should do. I mean, there's a great deal of truth in the phrase, count your blessings. In fact, it's a fundamental part of good stewardship, appreciating and acknowledging the many ways in which we are truly blessed. It's just that no matter how many times I read the Beatitudes we've heard again this morning, I'm always struck by what Jesus seems to deem as blessing, or moreover, whom among us are truly hashtag blessed. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't see anyone posting on Facebook a picture of Kobe Bryant's family in mourning with such a tagline. Or pictures of the devastation of the earthquakes in Puerto Rico or the fires in Australia with the same. Or a selfie of someone receiving chemo treatment with the word hashtag blessed. If anything, I expect the opposite. And yet, according to Jesus, blessed are those who seem to suffer in so many different ways. Which got me thinking a lot about that word blessed this week. Perhaps it's the way it gets thrown around so carelessly these days that causes us to misunderstand what Jesus is really saying. After all, the Greek word Jesus uses, makarios, is actually translated in several different ways depending upon your particular version of Scripture. For example, in Eugene Peterson's first draft of the Message, his ambitious attempt at translating the New Testament into contemporary everyday language, the Beatitudes didn't speak of blessing, but rather luck. Although his editors nixed the bold move because they couldn't swallow the idea that the poor and the meek are somehow lucky. Then there's the French edition of the New Jerusalem Bible, which translates the Greek as debonair. While such a word might conjure up for us the image of Cary Grant wearing a bow tie, the word really just means of good disposition, or we might say content, which still doesn't quite resonate given those Jesus is describing. But the most troubling might be the handful of translations that use the word honored or favored. I mean, if given a choice, would not the grieving mother opt to have her child returned to her than be among God's honored? Or does it really feel like much of a blessing, let alone a favor, to be 55 years old, diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and given only weeks to live? I certainly didn't think so. That is, until my experience with Jim. He'd been one of my predecessors in my previous congregation. He was beloved by the community, having served just about every disciple congregation in Christian County, Kentucky, along with being a chaplain to the local retirement community and nursing care facility. In fact, Jim had been somewhat of a mentor to me, our paths having crossed while I was in divinity school several years before. And so you can imagine how I felt the day he called me out of the blue to tell me that he was dying of cancer. He had only a few weeks to live, and he wanted me to preside at his funeral. I met with Jim several days in the lead up to his death, but it was our last meeting that I will always remember. We were talking about the details of his funeral, making plans for after he was gone, discussing all that he'd been through and all that was to come. And toward the end of our conversation, he looked over at me, his face weak and ashen from illness, a sense of tiredness present all over his body. And knowing he was only days from the inevitability of his own death, he said to me, "You know, Nathan, I'm a lucky man. I've been able to make the decision to end treatment on my own terms. I no longer have to be on the hospital and doctor carousel. My family's been able to be home with me, and we've had more quality time and conversation than we have in years. I get to spend my final days doing what I want with whom I want. And the people of this community, they've just been so kind and generous to us. I know it's a cliche. I'm content. I'm even happy. Nathan, I just feel blessed." I thought to myself, that's not a cliche, Jim. That's a beatitude. And this morning, if we were to search deep enough within ourselves, I suspect we might discover the same. Like the blessing of relief that came when you finally ended that unhealthy relationship. Or the blessing of comfort you felt from friends and family and church when you lost your loved one. Or the blessing of joy you experienced when you finally said what you felt called to say despite the persecution you received for it. Or the blessing of peace you had when things didn't turn out the way you hoped, but you knew it was for the best. Or the blessing of mercy you received from being merciful to someone else. Look, I get it. These aren't exactly your grandmother's beatitudes, or at least certainly not mine. You know, like, blessed are men with sensible wives. Blessed are people who mind their tongues. Blessed are women whose children make them glad. Don't get me wrong, these are all biblical. They come from the wisdom tradition in Scripture, which suggests that one's good actions always lead to some kind of concrete reward. We still hear it today in churches that preach the prosperity gospel. If you'll simply pray harder, work harder, just be more faithful, you'll be rewarded, you will be blessed. It's just that Jesus turns this understanding of blessing completely on its head. After all, for him, blessing or contentment or honor or favor or happiness or however you want to translate it has absolutely nothing to do with what we do. Jesus doesn't say, blessed are those who give to the poor in spirit, or blessed are those who wipe the tears of those who mourn, or blessed are you who include the excluded. No, blessing doesn't come from what we do. It comes from what God has already done and is continuing to do in each and every one of our lives, despite our grief, despite our pain, despite being hated or excluded or not wanted. Blessings abound if you'll only look for them. It's just about vision. What do you see? Hashtag curses? Or hashtag blessings? It reminds me of Henry Nouwen's distinction between optimism and hope. Nouwen says they're radically different attitudes. Optimism, he says, is the expectation that things like the weather and human relationships and the economy and the political situation and so on, they'll get better. Grandma's Beatitudes were optimistic. You could act in a good way and expect good things to happen. Hope, though, according to Nouwen, is the trust that God will fulfill God's promises to us in a way that leads us to true freedom. While the optimist speaks about concrete changes in the future, the person of hope lives in the moment, no matter how hard the circumstances, with the knowledge and trust that all of life is in God's good hands. Which is the reason I like Reverend Jorge Lara Brad's translation of Jesus' words via the Spanish Bienaventuranza, which translates in English as a good adventure to you. He says, we all know that adventure means risk. The courage to defy the odds, the refusal to play it safe, to follow Jesus, to trust God is no picnic. It's an adventure full of risk requiring courage. I think I've shared with you before the story of my best friend from college, who also happens to have the name Nathan, although I call him Nate so we don't get confused. About 3 years ago, Nate tragically fell down a flight of stairs, incurred a traumatic brain injury, and was in a coma for several months. Slowly, he's come out of it, and suffice to say, the last 3 years have been quite an adventure for Nate. Hospitals and rehabs and therapy. He's had to learn and walk and to talk again. He's had to, quite frankly, learn how to do everything again. While I was in Fort Worth for my conference last week, he and I spent part of the day together. We walked TCU's campus, reminiscing on our days there. I pieced together for him memories that he no longer has about where he lived, where we ate, and many of the poor decisions we made along the way. We were in the car driving somewhere, and we were talking about all he'd been through, and he said to me, you know, Nathan, despite all I've been through, I still feel blessed. I can see clearly that God's been with me every step of the way, and the people that have supported me, and the strength I've somehow found to endure all this. Even in my memory loss to some degree. Sure, I wish I could remember so many things. But you know, based on stories people have told to me about certain times of my life, there are some things I'm happy to forget. which it turns out is one of the most popular translations we find of the Beatitudes. Not blessedness, but happiness, which I suppose makes sense, given that true joy doesn't come from what we have or what we do, but rather in God's promise that no matter who we are, what we've done or haven't done, what kind of burden we carry, what kind of task we must face, we are blessed simply by being God's. I suppose in the end, the Beatitudes could be summed up in a social media post. Something like, no matter our circumstances, blessings abound. Do you see them? Hashtag blessed.